Welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, and we're going to take a departure from our normal kind of news of the week, opinion of kind of recent sports, basketball, pop culture news, and just go over an upcoming article I'm writing. Brian, I actually did get a tweet to the Boxscore Geeks Twitter account that asked if we've given up on writing articles. I can see why people think that.
Yeah.
Basically, just when life gets in the way and then the NBA season slows down, we kind of just goes with the flow. It's the summer. Our content production tends to drop off in the summer. Good thing is we do still keep the podcast going. But I do have an article I'm writing, and I figured we'd just have an accompanying podcast for that. So as I mentioned, I'm your host, Ray Alvarez. With me, as always, is our producer, co-host, scriptwriter, Mini Hats Brian. That's a good name, Brian. Mini Hats Brian. So Brian Foster, you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Say hey, Brian.
What's going on, Dre? I'm not wearing an actual hat right now, but, I like the analogy. We're in that point of the NBA offseason where most everything has been decided. There's still this Kyrie Irving and Carmelo Anthony stuff hanging over us, but nothing's been resolved there that we haven't talked about last week. And on top of that, those two players probably aren't going to matter that much for their teams, unlike the mainstream thinks. So, I'm happy to get into some of these other topics.
Yeah, so speaking of overrated players, I basically wanted to strike while the iron's hot, while he's still a somewhat relevant name. I wrote an article a few years back about Kobe Bryant called 20 Players Better Than Kobe. And, obviously this got some kerfluffle, but at one point I had said Robert Parrish was a better player than Kobe Bryant, and there was some backlash to it. Now, of course, Robert Parrish is a 2010 monster in the 1980s on the Celtics. The 1986 Celtics is considered one of the best teams ever whenever you get the lists. And I was kind of like, it's not hard to think that Robert Parrish, who I think ended his career, and I think probably still has the record as most games in the NBA, it's not absurd to think that he had a better career than Kobe Bryant's, especially when you look at how dominant he was in his prime. And then I kind of said, well, it's really hard to argue a lot of players that we like better than Kobe just kind of easily. So as an example, one of my favorite players is Dikembe Mutombo. And in most years of Dikembe Mutombo's prime, it would be hard for you to try and convince people that he was a better player than Kobe, even though, by our numbers, there were some years he was the best player in the league. And in fact, there was an interesting per-ish metric made by IBM that said he was the best player in 2001 in the league. So we'll say wins produced, he blows him away, and people will say, can you really put him better than Kobe? And a lot of years it was hard because Dikembe Mutombo wouldn't make All-NBA. Dikembe Mutombo wouldn't start the All-Star game. Dikembe Mutombo wouldn't crack 10 points in a game. So it was hard, but there were some years where he was Defensive Player of the Year. So when I went over these 20 players that had a better career than Kobe, I said I looked for players that had a better Bricado prime. To remind people of what we're talking about, James Bricado came up with this concept. The average NBA career is 6 seasons. So what you do is you take any given player, you find their 6 best seasons, and this helps adjust for things like...
Could be non-consecutive, too, right?
That's the real importance of it is non-consecutive, because they're players, that get an injured year in the middle of their prime. Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, and Larry Bird actually all got injured really early in their careers. So there's, it removes injured seasons, it removes kind of just off years. Basically, you say what was the best this player looked like over their career, and then 6 seasons. That gives you kind of a nice prime to compare players across. Then I also looked at career wins produced. So I basically said they had to exceed Kobe Bryant's career wins produced as well as exceeding his prime. And then the last part that I added to this criteria in this article called 20 Players Better Than Kobe was I basically said there had to be some mainstream validation. To remind people of this article, I said the player won an MVP, the player won multiple, this was the rough part for me, I actually had to say multiple Defensive Player of the Year awards. They made it to multiple finals and won at least one, or they were the all-time leader in a given stat. So, for instance, this is an easy one. I was on Twitter last night, and somebody was arguing with me about this. John Stockton is easily a much better player than Kobe Bryant. In fact, according to our numbers, and I want to stress this is longevity-based, he is the all-time career wins producer. And the real reason for this is he entered the league, I think, at age 19, and he played till he was 40, and he was still playing peak level in his 40s, which is ridiculous. You know, there are players that have played forever, such as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan. But, you know, Tim Duncan played high level till he was late in his career, but he saw a dramatic decrease in minutes. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar saw a dramatic decrease in performance in his last couple of years. Same with like Kevin Garnett and Shaq. So John Stockton had like the best longevity career in NBA history. Probably won't be matched. And he ends leading the NBA in all-time steals and assists. And if you go look up these records, they're never going to get touched. You're never going to touch John Stockton's all-time assist and steal records. It's just not going to happen. So to me, it was remarkable to go, is it really that hard for me to say John Stockton had a better career than Kobe Bryant? Given these facts, right? Given his wins produced, given his mainstream accolades, given that he's ending his career like all time. And I think, do you recall off the top of your head, Brian? So Kobe Bryant is ended his career with the most, let's see. He finished his career with the most misses in NBA history. I forget where he finished on points. I think he was at best fourth. Do you recall?
But we can look that up real fast.
So I'm trying to do that on my slow throw. But if you why don't you beat me to it and I'll keep talking. So anyway, that was kind of the crux of my 20 players better than Kobe. Now here's where it gets more interesting. I'm going to argue that Kobe Bryant isn't a top 5 all-time player. Now, my 20 players better than Kobe article obviously already answers that. If I say there were 20 players with better NBA careers than Kobe, it's not hard for me to say I don't think Kobe Bryant's on Mount Rushmore, even of contemporary players. So I went a step further, though, and I said I was going to look at every single season Kobe Bryant was considered an MVP caliber player. And so for reference, Kobe Bryant finished top 10 in MVP voting every season from 2000 to 2013. Obviously, I disagree. So what I did, though, is I went through each of these years and I did the same kind of criteria, Brian. I looked for star players, and by star players, I'm going to do 2. You typically look for players that are twice as good as the average NBA player, which is a wins per 48 of 200 or better. This translates to a points over par of 3, which means if you took that player, put them on an average team, played another average team the full 48 minutes, you would expect that team with your player to win by 3 points on average. And then I also looked for a player that had kind of what I consider my criteria for wins produced, Brian, for stars, which is 10 wins per season in a given season. So if they were a 200 player plus 3 points over par with 10 wins, I adjusted 1999 and 2012, of course, for this. If they were a star via that criteria, had more wins total than Kobe Bryant in that season, and also basically were voted to the All-NBA team. I included MVP top 5 voting as well as Defensive Player of the Year. But it turns out if you were a top 5 in MVP voting or were voted the Defensive Player of the Year, you made an All-NBA team. So I made this harder than myself. But so here's the crux of kind of what I did, Brian. I looked at a crop of 15 players every year, usually 14 because Kobe Bryant typically made All-NBA. I said, were they better than Kobe by our numbers? Did mainstream agree that they were a good player? This is All-NBA. And, were they a star player? And every single season of Kobe's MVP reign, I was able to easily come up with 5 names better than him. And so I kind of wanted to discuss 3 different eras of Kobe Bryant's kind of career. So you have 2000 to 2004. This is obviously the Shaq and Kobe era where they're winning titles. Kobe Bryant's, a great second title to Shaquille O'Neal, but no one's going to be lulled into thinking this isn't Shaquille O'Neal's team. And in fact, that was one of the key things. If you look at top 5 NBA players, at least in terms of mainstream criteria, that's all NBA, and having better wins per 48 and having better wins produced than Kobe, shocker, Shaquille O'Neal is a better player all 5 of those seasons, 2000 to 2004. which was when the Lakers had a three-peat, won back-to-back titles from 2000 to 2002, lost in 2003 to the Spurs, and then won in 2000, and then didn't win. They made it to the finals in 2004 before falling to the Detroit Pistons. Shaquille O'Neal was a significantly better player than Kobe Bryant. So that's not really shocking. Additionally, another player in that era that shows up is Ben Wallace. Ben Wallace is usually a better player than Kobe Bryant. So I don't really know the easiest way to jump into this, Brian, because I wanted to discuss the three eras of Kobe and discuss how every single one of these eras, he was not ever really a top five player and why. But I figured I'd let you jump in if you had any thoughts, questions on my methodology, or if this even matters in the grand scheme of things.
Well, I do have an update. Let's get back to this. According to basketballreference.com, the best, basketball stats site out there, always check them out if you somehow don't know about them. It's actually the top scores are the same if you look at NBA versus ABA or combined. Mm-hmm. And that is going to be Abdul-Jabbar number 1, Malone number 2, and then Bryant is number 3 for both of those.
Who was number 4? Because he passed number
4. 4 was Michael Jordan, and 5th was Chamberlain. So there you go. 5 big-time scores.
And then, of course, though, if you compare the total number of shots it took all of them to get to those marks, get that Michael Jordan spent 3 years in college, was injured his second season in the NBA for most, if not, I think he played like 8 games. I think he missed almost all the season, and then quit 2 years in his prime to play baseball. When you factor though, that's like 6 seasons that Kobe got that Michael Jordan didn't get. And I believe he barely passed Michael Jordan in scoring. So is what it is.
That's correct.
Okay. So there's that. And then, like I said, do you have any questions on the methodology or issues, before we just jump in?
I don't know. Let's go.
All right, so the first key point I want to make is it's really, really hard to get this point across to people, but I'm going to try. When I say Kobe Bryant wasn't a top 20 NBA player, even if we went contemporary, which, I had to because a lot of the old numbers, for instance, I would easily rank Jerry West and Wilt Chamberlain above Kobe Bryant, but we don't have complete stats for them, and we can't really make the same nuanced opinion of those players as we can with Kobe. And then, of course, I've made the same argument, which is if you look at the 1960s and 70s in basketball, it's a much different league than we have now. There's no restricted free agency. There's no free agency. They've got weird drafts. They've got the territorial draft. The league is significantly smaller. For instance, the 1960s, I think really Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson are the only, and then Jerry West, like I said, those are like 3 of the only players I'd probably comfortably say were probably better than Kobe, and even then I'd have to.
Another big one is Bill Russell.
No.
Okay, interesting.
This is a much more interesting topic for another day.
So what's the Bill Russell anti-argument?
Russell sucked at offense. This is what's remarkable to me is I'm not saying Bill Russell wasn't great, but when people start listing Bill Russell on their top X centers and he places 3. He sucked at offense. And the key point, and I'll bring Kobe back into this too in a second. He played next to Wilt Chamberlain, and Wilt Chamberlain was amazing at both offense and defense. If you go look at the Warriors and the Lakers, yes, they weren't like amazing defensive teams, but they weren't horrible. And then, as I've mentioned, I always kind of get annoyed when people don't factor in, things like rebounds. And we don't have the stats. That's what makes Bill Russell and Wilt painful. We don't have things like blocks and steals for those eras. They weren't added to the box score until 1974, which is long after Russell and Chamberlain's primes. But all I'm saying is you can't look at Bill Russell and say he sucked at offense, but everybody did, because there were players like Oscar Robertson, like Jerry West, like Wilt Chamberlain, who actually excelled at offense. And so the same thing becomes true of Kobe. When people try and defend Kobe's shooting efficiency, because he's very mediocre, I wrote another article on this, which I basically said, if you look at Kobe's career scoring accolades, he's basically average. He's an average player, at least in terms of what's known as effective field goal percentage, which factors in 2-point shooting efficiency, 3-point shooting efficiency. You put those two together, he is completely average. The one area he excels is he gets fouled more than average and scores well from the line. But I noted, and I was called crazy for this by Neil Payne over at 538, but if you basically took an average player and gave them the same number of shots through their career as Kobe, we would expect them to basically be right behind Kobe on the all-time scoring list. And then a better way you and I had a discussion, I forget, a year or two ago on the podcast, Brian, about this. A better way to think of it is if you had two players called average that just had average on the back of their jersey that played the wing position and combined took the same number of shots as Kobe, which isn't unreasonable to think because Kobe was a ball hog, and then tallied up their career totals, essentially by the end of their career they'd look the same as Kobe's. And sorry, I've just got a cold or something. But the key there is if you wouldn't be impressed by like two players' careers on your team's impact on offense, you shouldn't be impressed when it's one player doing it. And in fact, quite the contrary. That's why, by the way, your Golden State Warriors, for those of you that don't know, Brian is a huge Golden State Warriors fan. That's what makes them so freaking special, is this is a team that has all high-efficiency scores that move the ball. And I saw some great quote this week, Steve Kerr, which said something like, you pass the ball, and you shoot the ball, and that's a good offense, or something like that. It sounds like a Steve Kerr thing to say.
Very Popovich statement, yeah.
That's all I'm saying, is that if you look at teams like the Warriors and the Rockets that do, lots of ball movement, lots of high-efficiency shots, that's a glorious thing to look at. But when you basically say, well, Kobe Bryant managed to take more shots than anybody at a completely average rate, you don't go good. You go, well, that doesn't really help.
So I got one more question about this before we move on. So I think the argument for Bill Russell is basically he's like Ben Wallace, right? Not great on offense, but he just focused on defense, and he was amazing at that. Obviously, we don't know what his blocks and steals and turnovers were. However, Ben Wallace kind of minimized his liability on offense by not taking a lot of shots. Is the problem that Russell just still took a lot of shots and was bad at it, or what? How is his offense so bad that he's not a Ben Wallace kind of player?
This is funny because I have so much research prepared for Kobe, and you're throwing me curveballs asking about Ben Wallace and Bill Russell.
Oh, I know.
But so here's the key, and my computer's just too slow. Again, one of these days I will swap out this Surface Pro for one of my Macs and then maybe get a new Mac or MacBook Air or something. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at Ben Wallace's career, and this page is loading forever, his true shooting percentage wasn't great, but it wasn't horrible. I believe he was average, if not a little better than. Bill Russell was significantly worse than average at scoring. And that's even factoring in his era. So that's all I'm saying is that I might, if I broke everything down, give the nod to Russell over Kobe. I just think Bill Russell is highly overrated in the annals of NBA history. And when I'm trying to come up with names, when I'm coming up with names now, like I said, the top 20 list, I had this huge criteria. This every year never being a top 5, I'm going to have, I have a criteria that I have to look at. I just don't want to include Bill Russell because I've made the argument time and time again that the past NBA just would not be able to compete with the current NBA. And by that, as I mentioned, there are two different models. You've got the time machine model, which is we go back in time to 1964. We get a time machine. We put Bill Russell in it. We bring him to the future. We let him train up or whatever. And then we try and play him on a modern NBA team. And he's just going to get smoked compared to other modern NBA players. The other alternative is I go back in time. I find 5-year-old, 10-year-old Bill Russell. I bring him to a modern NBA school, right? I put him in St. Mary's with LeBron James. I let him go through the entire process, modern training, modern diet. In that regard...
This doesn't sound like a very ethical experiment, Dre.
Yeah, this is not how you use...
Young Bill Russell gets forced into slavery here, but... sorry, continue.
Anyway, my point being, that one they might have a case, but even then, the issue is, when I go back in time and look at a player like Wilt Chamberlain or Oscar Robertson, who just excelled at everything in the game, right? Offense, defense, just kicked ass. I've got no problem with the argument that they would probably kick ass modern NBA. Same thing with like Dr. J. But when I have a player with major deficiencies in the past, I go, maybe with modern training they would be better at it, but I don't know. And so when we're trying to make these apples to oranges comparison, it's just easier to leave them off the list. And as I noted, I didn't even bring any of these players up. On my top 20 list, I even said, I'm going to leave those players off because we don't have complete stats and it was a different league, and I was still able to easily come up with 26 names. So
that's true.
Okay, so back to the top 5, and the key just being that it's really, really hard to be a top NBA player, right? When I'm asking you to be an all-time great, already on NBA's Mount Rushmore, you've got Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson. I'd argue LeBron James easily now, right? I've said that before. And I'm not even including all the names. Those are just, in my opinion, like the 4 both mainstreamish comboed with advanced analytics players that I would probably put on mine in terms of accomplishments, meaning titles, in terms of wins produced, in terms of other stupid advanced stats that I don't even consider advanced and won't even mention, in terms of things like all-star accolades. It's really hard to make it to the top. And the same point comes up when we're talking about Kobe Bryant. So let's break down 3 different periods. There's 2000 to 2004, where Kobe is basically second fiddle to Shaq. And I'm going to list off a couple names to you really quick, Brian. We're going to do this a few times. Okay, so the first name is obviously Shaquille O'Neal. He's on the same team as Shaq. Kobe Bryant during that entire stretch was never better than Shaq. And so I made this point a few podcasts ago where basically when you're saying Kobe Bryant's not top 5, are you crazy? And I go, it's really hard to be a top 5 player in the NBA, and often the top 5 has incumbents in it, meaning a great player, you get LeBron James on your team, you're going to be great for a couple of years until he runs out of steam, right? He has kept the Cavaliers relevant even as the rest of their team is atrophied. So from 2000 to 2004, here are 3 names I want you to keep in mind. I want you to keep in mind Shaquille O'Neal, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett. I'm going to try and I thought there was one more. Oh, Jason Kidd, kind of Dikembe Mutombo, kind of Dirk Nowitzki. And I believe that's and then Ben Wallace. Okay, so the easy big ones, right? Shaq, Ben Wallace, Tim Duncan, and who was the 4th big I named? How am I already dropping this? There we go. Like there was a golden era of bigs in the NBA that no one's, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, Shaquille O'Neal all won MVP. It's actually shocking to me that Kevin Garnett and Shaquille O'Neal only won 1 each. More shocking for Shaquille O'Neal with how good his teams were. Then, of course, Ben Wallace, 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, helped the Pistons to 6 straight conference finals, 2 back-to-back finals, and a title. That's not even hard. Then, of course, I bring up Jason Kidd, who, Jason Kidd was the triple-double machine before Russell Westbrook. So this isn't really hard. And then I brought up, some weaker ones, but Dikembe Mutombo, a Defensive Player of the Year, and Dirk Nowitzki, who, not in that era, but in the 2000s, in 2001 and 2002, I consider him a better player than Kobe Bryant, did go on to win MVP in 2007. So I'm listing a bunch of players that either won multiple Defensive Player of the Year in their career, won an MVP, and had multiple seasons from 2000 to 2004. And in the case of Jason Kidd and Shaquille O'Neal, every year they were better than him. And then Tim Duncan, every year except 2001, where he was injured, was better. So it's not a very hard problem to go. Kobe Bryant wasn't top 5 from 2000 to 2004. First off, he's on the same team as Shaq, and you're crazy if you don't think Shaq is the better player on the Lakers from 2000 to 2004. And there are also some great names. Tim Duncan, like I said, multi-MVP, multi-finals MVP. Kevin Garnett, MVP, Defensive Player of the Year. Jason Kidd, who never quite got to that level of getting MVP, unfortunately, but was really high in the voting and was just a great player. So, again, not really hard to say Kobe Bryant's not a top 5 player in this era, which, by the way, this era is a huge part of why he gets credit in his career. The 3 titles he wins with Shaq are why people will list him as greatest all time. And this is something that, by the way, just drives me nuts. If you factor out Shaquille O'Neal in the 2000s from Kobe Bryant, you basically, I don't know, it's really hard. I almost got stuff. It's like people seem to do this. They seem to think that Kobe Bryant got 3 rings without Shaquille O'Neal, despite the fact that Shaquille O'Neal was 3-time Finals MVP, got the Triple Crown in 2001, Finals MVP, regular season MVP, All-Star MVP. It's just kind of remarkable to me. So this period of time is really easy, even though this is right when he starts getting MVP recognition. Anything to add on that?
Yeah, so I've been cycling through the list of win producers during that period of time, right, for each year. Yeah, and of course, it really strikes you how great the big men were during this era, right? And you mentioned them all: Duncan, Wallace, Garnett, and you have guys like
Alonzo.
Go ahead.
I was going to say Alonzo Mourning was ridiculous. I was looking at his name in the late 90s and early 2000s. Defensive Player of the Year winner, a fantastic player, Alonzo Mourning too. And I didn't even bring his name up because he was only better than Kobe Bryant by these metrics in 2000.
It's just really tough to find a way to narrow it down in Kobe's favor, right? So even if you're just looking at guards, yeah, I mean, you're going to see Nash, you're going to see John Stockton up there all the time, you're going to see Jason Kidd up there all the time. But there's even other guys that are finishing higher than Kobe in some of these years. You're seeing Brent Barry up there sometimes. You're seeing Doug Christie, some more defensive players.
And what makes it hard, though, and I mentioned this, so like I have a spreadsheet that I'm going off of that I'll use for my article. It kills me because in my world, Brent Barry would be a first ballot Hall of Famer. Yeah. In my world, Brent Barry would have gotten MVP votes above Kobe. I think his best season, he was either best in the league. He was top 3 wins produced for a season.
Yeah, we have that right here. It's 2002, 2003. He finished 3rd behind Ben Wallace and Elton Brand. So there you go.
That's ridiculous.
Ahead of Garnett and Duncan.
But he gets dropped off the list because basically I say, did the mainstream consider him a top NBA player? And they didn't. But I'm saying even if I only restrict myself to great players. So you said 2002?
2002, 2003 was his top season. 2003
was rough because Kobe Bryant, that was one of Kobe Bryant's best seasons. He got 12.3 wins produced. What was his wins per 48?
Let's see. I'm scrolling down here. Okay, we finally found him. 0.154.
That's good, but I mean, basically the reason he gets that high wins produced is tons and tons of minutes, which again, that's Kobe Bryant's. If you want to say Kobe Bryant is an all-timer, I will give you longevity and amount of playing. That is, he was ridiculous at that. I've got no complaints.
He just doesn't have those individual Brent Barry kind of seasons, right? He's not a consistently good. He's not consistently great or sometimes great. He's just always good, if that makes sense.
Let's list this down in terms of either Defensive Player of the Year, All-NBA, or top 5 in MVP voting. You got Ben Wallace, who was 10 wins better than Kobe Bryant in 2003, All-NBA, Defensive Player of the Year. Kevin Garnett, 7.4 wins better than Kobe Bryant, top 5 in MVP voting, All-NBA. Tim Duncan, who I believe won the MVP in 2003, 5.2 wins better than Kobe Bryant, All-NBA, won the MVP. Now, Jason Kidd, this is the rough one. He only, I'll put in quotes, won All-NBA, but 4 wins better than Kobe. Tracy McGrady, this was the only year in this region, 2000 to 2004, but don't forget Tracy McGrady was part of like the same amazing high school crop or whatever. He's top 5 in MVP voting for Orlando, finishes All-NBA, 3.2 wins better than Kobe. Now, here's where it gets close at least, right? I mentioned Shaquille O'Neal was always better. Shaquille O'Neal, top 5 MVP voting, All-NBA, only 1.8 wins better than Kobe. And then Steve Nash, this is the only season from 2000 to 2004 where he was better than Kobe, but only 0.3 wins better than Kobe. But as you'll notice, Ben Wallace, Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, Jason Kidd, Tracy McGrady, that's 5 players, all who have 3 wins better than Kobe, and that's with Kobe playing the wheels off the season. So, like that's and you're as you noted, there were players that I left off the list, like Elton Brand, like Brent Barry, because they were not given the mainstream accolades I would think they deserved that year.
And they didn't have like 6 great, maybe Brent Barry did, but hey, let me tell you something else about that year, though, since we still have it up here. John Barry was also finished with more wins than Kobe. 2 of the Barry brothers beat him. He finished with 0.1 wins less than Scott Pollard from the Sacramento Kings, who can't even spell his name. It only has 1 T. Like Scott with 1 T Pollard beat Kobe out this year. And again, it wasn't a bad year for Kobe. It's just, I want to echo your point, how difficult it is to get into that top 5.
Even leaving out names that people will scoff at us for saying, like, we love you, Brent Barry. But not hard to just say Ben Wallace, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, Shaquille O'Neal, and then take your pick of Jason Kidd, Tracy McGrady, Steve Nash, Dirk Nowitzki, Chauncey Billups. Lots of good names that make it obvious why he doesn't finish top 5 any of those seasons.
Dirk Nowitzki, Gary Payton, David Robinson, like these are Sean Marion. These are some really good players.
Alonzo
Mourning.
Ray Allen in 2001. Remember when Peja was good?
Reggie Miller was also better than him that season, Dre. Like, no one's going to say Reggie Miller's bad.
Yeah. Well, but it is funny because we'll say Reggie Miller had a better career than Kobe, and people will look at us so nuts. Now, So 2004, after they lose in the finals, there's a split. Shaquille O'Neal goes to the Heat. They like win the East the first year, but don't make it to the finals, and then make the finals and win in 2006. And this is the era where Kobe, is on a titleless team, on a non-contending team. And this gets a lot easier because it turns out that Kobe Bryant actually kind of went into a slump. In 2005 and 2006, Kobe Bryant wasn't that great of a player. Now, in 2007 and 2008, he does return to, I'll put in quotes, star form, but there becomes a very obvious reason now why Kobe Bryant doesn't, is still off the top five. Now, the first two names that are going to get easy, and I believe they both fall for almost every year. I think Steve Nash had some injuries. LeBron James and Steve Nash. LeBron James enters the league in 2002. It was 2002, 2000. It was 2003, 2004, right? So LeBron James' second year in the league, he has a huge spike, and LeBron James from 2005 till the rest of Kobe's career is a better player than Kobe Bryant, who gets all NBA, all-star, all the accolades, ends up with 5 MVPs. This is not hard, right? From 2005 on, and we'll get to this when we return to Kobe's championship seasons and contending seasons, but LeBron James is going to take a spot from Kobe for the rest of his career. If we're talking Kobe Bryant being top 5, he is never, ever, 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 ever better than LeBron James. And I hope that's not a controversial statement. All right, don't forget that Steve Nash goes to Phoenix and looks amazing, wins back-to-back MVPs, and Steve Nash just plays amazing. And I'm trying, again, it's a little rougher for me to talk back and forth. I'm amazed at how slow this is. But Steve Nash, I believe, for 4 or 5 of those seasons from 2005 to, I'm going to say 2005 to 2008, yeah, every year. That's 4 seasons. From 2005 to 2008, Steve Nash is a better player. And then another player, this one's going to be rough. Dwight Howard from 2006 on is like a much better player than Kobe through 2012, where Dwight Howard, four-time defensive player of the year, Dwight Howard, he was a 2010 machine. He's a behemoth. So, right, this doesn't get hard. Steve Nash, Dwight Howard, LeBron James. Now you've got a new crop of players that are keeping Kobe down, not to mention the fact that Tim Duncan and Kevin Garnett are still around. So this doesn't make it hard. And as I mentioned, what people seem to forget about this point in Kobe's career from 2005 to 2008, when he does win MVP, and we'll talk about this season in a second, but 2005, 2006, he's not the same looking player as he was before. In fact, he was one of the first down 3-1 in the playoffs upsets in the wrong direction. They were up 3-1 to the Suns and they got upset. Kobe Bryant is just not as good during this period, and it's pretty easy to say other players that are better than him. And in fact, this is part of his legacy that to me makes him a little harder to justify because, for instance, LeBron James has played on some rough teams, and when you take LeBron James off those teams look terrible, right? When he left the Cavaliers in 2012, 2011, whatever year, the Cavs just fell apart without him. Kobe Bryant, when Shaq left, looked much worse, and Kobe Bryant did not really return to form until Andrew Bynum looked good, and they picked up Pau Gasol in 2008. But so that's that stretch of time. Anything to say on 2005 to 2008?
Yeah, so more just great players entered the league and permanently put themselves above Kobe. Chris Paul is one that I want to point out. He came in kind of the end of that era. You're probably going to talk about him next, but he was there. Tyson Chandler is another guy who was in the top 10, top 5 during that whole time, and Andre Iguodala as well. And there's probably others I'm just not thinking of. But
Andre Iguodala is a name that I'm going to exclude from my list, which pains me.
Okay, that's fair.
He's not going to get the All-NBA.
He might have more rings than Kobe by the end. We'll see.
Oh, that would be amazing. Won't happen, but that would be amazing. All right, well, what I did want to talk about is Kobe Bryant's 2008 season, where he did win the MVP, and it was one of the most cruel MVPs. He beat out Chris Paul, and it was a very dumb narrative. Very late in the season, Chris Paul and Kobe Bryant played a game against each other, and many argued that because the Lakers beat the Hornets that year, that was what shifted the voters' favor in terms of that. And then let's not forget that playoffs too. The Spurs were arguably a better team on paper. They got trapped on the tarmac during an away game and then lost that game next. So it's questionable, right, if the Lakers should have even made the finals. And then let's not forget that was the ridiculous Pau Gasol trade, which I argue is a big part of it, right? They got Pau Gasol for nothing. They got Pau Gasol for Kwame Brown and the future rights to Marc Gasol. And I'm sorry, here's what's ridiculous. With how Pau Gasol has wound up playing on the Spurs and the Bulls, Pau Gasol has just been the better player than Marc Gasol. There was, of course, Marc Gasol's Defensive Player of the Year season, But the reality is, Pau Gasol, if it was Pau Gasol now for Marc Gasol in the future, Pau Gasol is better, and then Kwame Brown was a horrible player.
Pau Gasol just had a much longer prime than Marc.
Yeah, and then I'm also just going to note is, 2008, a big reason Kobe Bryant wins that MVP, it's very reminiscent to me of 2001 with Dikembe Mutombo going to the 76ers. The voters don't vote mid-season trades for MVP, and it was like the team got better, and a large part of that was Pau Gasol showing up and playing really well for the Lakers, but they basically gave the credit to Kobe. But here are the players that are better than Kobe that season. Chris Paul was 10 wins better than Kobe. Dwight Howard, 6.1. LeBron James, 4.3. Now here's where, so this is like, if we're talking about the seasons where Kobe Bryant had the best argument for being a top 5, Steve Nash is only 2.5 wins better. Kevin Garnett's only 1.8 wins better than Deron Williams and Amari Stoudemire, Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili, and Paul Pierce. Those are all less than a win and a half. The reason I say it's his closest bet is right. When you get to like a 3-win threshold with 2 players, you can start making the arguments for things like, I'm not a fan of it, but like floor stretching, like defense. I did want to make one brief note about that, which is Steve Nash and Kobe Bryant. Now, when Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki are 2 players I've heard panned for their defenses, they actually had top 10 defenses in Dallas with both Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki. And when Kobe Bryant was on the Lakers, they had a lot of top 10 defenses. That was one of the reasons they were great when they won titles in the next period we're going to talk about. But those defenses seemed to vanish when Shaquille O'Neal and Gary Payton vanished, and seemed to come back when Andrew Bynum and Pau Gasol became relevant. So from my point, it's very hard. People will say, well, Kobe Bryant was a better defender. And I've always kind of bristled a little about that and how it's not as easy to measure as you think. And defenses, this is something a friend of the show, Ty Willinghans, has noted. Defenses can be schemes, right? We accept that Andre Iguodala is a great defender, but Andre Iguodala on the Warriors that are a great defensive scheme team as opposed to the Nuggets, well, the Nuggets were never a top 10 defensive team, I don't believe, with Andre Iguodala, whereas the Warriors have been the best defensive team in the league since acquiring Andre Iguodala. So it's kind of like, when you want to go, he is a great defender, and that is a huge impact, you have to go, is it though? And I've always had that question because
it's a tough one.
Because here's the thing. On offense, we've seen this. Kobe Bryant can just take every shot. That is perfectly allowed. Or better players like LeBron James and Steve Nash can just hog the possessions, but then pass the ball, shoot the ball effectively, etc. You can have a player that basically dominates the offense. Essentially, think a quarterback in football. But on defense, even if Kobe Bryant is a lockdown defender, and this was one of the arguments I heard made against Kawhi Leonard last season or 2 seasons ago, basically the other team can just say, you are a great defender, but we are going to, I'll put this quotes, minimize your defense, which I'm not saying this is bad, but if they force Kawhi to stay next to their best offensive player and then put him on an island, so to speak, which is also a football term, that minimizes what he can do. And it's not saying he's not effective at defense. It's not saying he doesn't still do things great like rebounds, steals, blocks, which are recorded in the box score, and thus we will give him credit for. But it's just to note, I don't think that you can have a lockdown defender that can shut down the opposing offense, whereas you can have an offensive player that the opposing defense just can't do anything with.
Yeah, and I struggle with this a lot too, because, so here's one thing we like to talk about a lot, which is, I guess the right way to put it is, front office sample size, basically. So every team's front office and, their coaching, like there's not very many seasons that we have as a sample size, right? Like they'll be in power for 2 seasons and make some number of moves, and we have to say, oh, how can we judge them by this? And things like that. So I think team defense can be like that in a way. So the Warriors are a great example, right? You just brought that up. So the narrative in the media and what's kind of, thought about in the NBA is this, basically. They were a horrible team for 30 plus years, 35, 40 years, and had a losing culture. And then, Mark Jackson, now out of coaching, now an analyst again, became their coach, and he instilled the defensive culture, so they got good at defense, but he was a flawed coach, so they needed to bring Steve Kerr and Ron Adams again, and that's what you're talking about right now, that Ron Adams system.
So their defenses, their offenses were great under Jackson. Were their defenses great, or? Because that's what I remember.
I'm just talking about the narrative. I'm not talking about what I think at all right now.
Because Steve Kerr, I recall
or the numbers.
Steve Kerr deferred to him, right? When they said, how is your defense so good? And he said, that wasn't me, that was Mark Jackson.
Yes.
seems like a very savvy. So what was Mark Jackson's last season, by the way? Was it 2014?
I can't remember.
But yeah, I mean, basically, we noted that was.
I think it was 14. Yeah,
that was a very savvy. Steve Kerr is a great politician, which
yes.
Arguably is what you need to be if you're going to survive as a coach. It's arguably why Mark Jackson did not survive as a coach.
So let me that was like halfway through the story, though. Let me put the countering view now, which I think a little bit more than that. And I'm not saying Ron Adams isn't a great defensive coach, or even Mark Jackson for that matter. But another way to look at it is when the Warriors got really good at defense all of a sudden, they added the aforementioned Andre Iguodala, who's considered to be a great individual defender. They traded for Andrew Bogut, who had great offensive years for the Warriors. And also, they drafted Draymond Green, who just kind of emerged out of nowhere and became a top defensive player. Even Steph Curry, for that matter, he was kind of hurt, playing like half seasons. All of a sudden, he just emerged one of the top stealing guys in the NBA. So just all of a sudden, their defensive talent just increased exponentially. So, yeah, where does that credit go? Is it all these guys who were good individual defenders before and came together? Is it the coaching scheme? I mean, the reporting's been saying this switching defense that they do is it's an innovative defense. So anyway, that's kind of my thinking about it.
Political, because one thing I've noticed, right, there's a lot of Trump in the news and why Trump won and why Hillary lost. And people basically, this is actually a very common logical fallacy that has showed up in the research. So here's the direct example. You give people like a fake medical quiz where you say this person is exhibiting these symptoms. Here are 3 diseases. Like disease A has this symptom, disease B has these symptoms, disease C has both symptoms, and you say the patient is exhibiting both symptoms, and you say, what do you think is the most likely cause? And most people are prone to say that they have the disease that exhibits both symptoms, even though the obvious other alternative is it's possible they have both diseases, each of which only has one symptom. I didn't quite explain that as well as I'd like because I don't have it in front of me written down because it was like pox and a fever or whatever. But the point being, people really, really like simple explanations that explain one thing. So the reason
narratives
I said it's
even better, right?
It's funny because it is possible to say Hillary Clinton ran a flawed campaign. There was Russian interference in the election. There were outside forces that helped Donald Trump. I'm not even talking Russian, the right climate or whatever for Donald Trump's brand.
The FBI violating the Hatch Act, like a whole bunch of different things, right?
There were a bunch. And so what's really hard is you say Russian interference hurt the election. And people say, well, Hillary Clinton just ran a bad campaign. You can go, it can be both.
Yeah.
And it can turn out that any one of those things, right, ran differently. Let's say hypothetically Hillary grabs Bernie Sanders as a running mate. Or the FBI doesn't release the email investigation late, or there's not as much Russian interference, or Donald Trump drops out early. There's a bunch of things that could have potentially changed the outcome of the election.
Or there's no electoral college.
That doesn't. I'm saying that one doesn't count because
okay.
But just the point being, any one of these could have flipped it. And so what happens is you get a bunch of people saying, no, this thing is the only reason. So you just said that about defense, or it's the same, right? We've always kind of been of that mentality. We're not saying coaching doesn't matter. What we've always said is you get good players, you get good coaching, and they kind of meld together. And so the same thing is true kind of for defense. Our opinion has always kind of been, or at least mine has been, you at least need a kind of like minimum viable level of defensive talent because there have been bad defenders on good teams. Glenn Baby Robinson was part of the best defensive squad for years with the Boston Celtics, who did have Kevin Garnett. Kevin Garnett, right before joining the Celtics and winning Defensive Player of the Year, was on a bottom 10 defense in Minnesota. So you kind of have to get a minimum viable set of players that can play good defense. And then if you have a coach or coaching system or whatever, coaching is always hard, right? We've mentioned this. Like was it Phil Jackson? Was it Phil Jackson with Tex Winters? Was it the Phil Jackson coaching staff? Was it the synergy of Phil Jackson, Michael Jordan, Phil Jackson, and Shaq? Really hard to know. So it's always possible that these things can kind of come together to make the story. But so my only point for defense, which I think we love, is that it is when people try and point to a single player as a defensive maker, I'm not saying that's necessarily untrue, but I'm saying for top defensive squads in the NBA, you need some combination of good teammates and or good coaching. to make it all work together. And the reason I bring this up is like, if you want to point to Kobe as being a great defender, well, during this era, 2005 to 2008, the Lakers are actually really, really horrible at defense until they acquire some bigs that are really good. And I've always laughed at this too with, for instance, Bruce Bowen, who everybody says is a defensive specialist. I'm not saying he wasn't, but I'm saying it's a little interesting that people point at how great he was at defense when you can kind of note that he had two fantastic, I'll put this in quotes, goalies behind him in Tim Duncan and David Robinson. If you've got Tim Duncan and David Robinson guarding the paint, it's probably a lot better to look good at defense. All I'm saying.
Yeah, and Bruce Bowen was also just kind of an intimidating player on defense, I think. And by that, I mean, he was considered a guy that would cheap shot you all the time. So you had to kind of have that in the back of your mind. I think, for instance, actually, we had this controversy, right, with someone on the Warriors, I forgot by now, landed under, it was Kawhi Leonard, right? Landed under Kawhi Leonard and hurt him. And then the comeback of that was, well, Bruce Bowen did that all the time. So, yeah, he kind of had a reputation.
All right. So I think that's so the two key parts of Kobe's legacy to me are basically Shaquille O'Neal and Pau Gasol. He joined the Lakers with Shaquille O'Neal. We discussed why he wasn't a top 5 player during the Shaquille O'Neal era. We discussed how without any support, and by the way, this is hard with any player without any support to be on a good team, but without any support, he wasn't a top 5 player. Let's end his career 2009 to 2013. This is the back-to-back titles. This is a few finals. This is the getting upset, even though they weren't really upset by the Mavericks, and then the final drop-off with, the sad ending with Dwight Howard and Steve Nash. So here's an easy name. So I've already mentioned LeBron James is kind of locked in, and Dwight Howard is kind of locked in. I'm going to add a couple other names that multiple seasons in a row are better players than Kobe Bryant. I'm going to give you Dwayne Wade, who was just, don't forget, Dwayne Wade, 2006 Finals MVP. Arguably, this is a fun one for me. Dwayne Wade, I believe, probably earned Finals MVP in 2012, I think. But in 2009, 2010, 2011, and 2013, he was injured in 2012. Dwayne Wade is a better player than Kobe Bryant. Chris Paul, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2013, better player than Kobe Bryant. 2010, he's injured. And then a huge name, obviously, that a new challenger has arrived, is Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant from 2010, 2012, 2013, better player. Tim Duncan sticks around, right? 2009 and 2010 is a better player. I'm trying to think. I think Kevin Garnett drops out at this point. Obviously, this is the rough one. Pau Gasol in 2009, 2010, and 2011 is a better player than Kobe. There are just so many names that it's easier. And I brought up that Kobe Bryant's kind of closest year was actually the year he won finals, or not finals, the year he won, he won MVP, the year before he won finals MVP. It was 2008 where he was close. He never comes close to that again. In 2009, the 5th best player in terms of top 5 players better than him is Pau Gasol, who is 6 wins better than him. In 2010, the 5th best player better than him is Steve Nash, who is 7 wins better than him. In 2011, Dwayne Wade is 7 wins better than him. In 2012, Dwight Howard is 9.5 wins better than him. And then in 2013, actually, this Dwayne Wade is this is an interesting one where there wasn't as much love this year. I'm trying to remember. I think there were Dirk Nowitzki was on the list, so I think it was a weaker crop of players that made All NBA. This is his closest, but Kevin Durant is obviously better than him. And Dwayne Wade is only 1.7. So in terms of Kobe Bryant's MVP worthy-ish seasons, that's where he gets a vote for MVP. 2008 and 2013 are the only seasons there are not 5 players better than him who both made All-NBA, had better wins produced, were legitimate I'm going to call them Brian Foster stars. That's 200 wins per 48. And then also finished 3 wins better. There were only 2 seasons where you could kind of maybe argue Kobe Bryant melding advanced stats and mainstream analytics would be a top 5 player, and that would be 2008 and 2013. And even then, I'm still fine leaving him off the list because there are players that don't get those distinctions that are easily better than him. You mentioned Tyson Chandler. There were some years Tyson Chandler was All NBA. There were some years he was Defensive Player of the Year, but there are many years that he was significantly better than Kobe that he didn't get the recognition and is going to be left off my list.
Yeah, in 2012, I think that's a big nail in the coffin for Kobe. In addition to Durant rising up, like you were talking about some of these other players, we've also got James Harden, Kawhi Leonard, and DeAndre Jordan already up kind of in the top 15 players, and they are not going to, we have the hindsight now, they're not going to leave that over the next 5 to 6 years. They're all way ahead of Kobe already. So, yeah, I think it's pretty much over at that point.
I will actually say Kobe Bryant's 2013 season is freaking remarkable.
Yeah, that was his one Renaissance season.
And by the way, some names that were great that we loved that were kind of left off of all NBA accolades were Chris Paul, Tyson Chandler, Joakim Noah, Steph. Your boy Steph Curry got snubbed that year too, right?
By 2013, he's up in the top 10.
Jimmy, this is the benefit of hindsight, right? Jimmy Butler, Marc Gasol, Paul George. This was back when we loved Paul George. There were some really good names that were left off of the All-NBA consideration that year, which is the only reason Kobe Bryant's even kind of in the mix. So, like, that season, I'm like, well, if you're restricted to All-NBA, Kobe Bryant's kind of close to that crop, but that says more about the voters that season, especially since, James Harden might end up being like a Jason Kiddish character where it's like the closest to MVP without getting MVP while still being an all-time great player. Chris Paul, I don't know why he didn't get the love. Probably because of Kobe Bryant on All-NBA, honestly.
That season, by the way, he got robbed. He was way better than everyone else in 2008.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Chris Paul during his prime was basically what Steph Curry is now during his prime, which is, I've mentioned this before, and I've had people that don't quite understand this. If you look at the before position adjusted production, we basically grade on the curve. We grade bigs next to bigs, wings next to bigs, point guards next to point guards. That's because they get different responsibilities. Again, I don't care about small ball to keep this somewhat contemporary. I love DeMarcus Cousins. They asked him, like, could him and Anthony Davis play next to each other in a small ball league? And he's like, I think it plays into our hands if they play small, which is a fantastic response. I'm actually really excited about the Pelicans this season to see a traditional point guard in Rondo and two traditional bigs in Anthony Davis and DeMarcus Cousins. I'm a fan of that team. I think the rest is probably
breaking news, by the way. The Pelicans signed Ian Clark for $1.6 million for 1 year. There's your Pelicans news.
Thank you for that, Brian. But yeah, 2013, there are just a lot of great names, and we grade on the curve. And so all I'm saying is Steph Curry and Chris Paul are two players that in their primes have looked like centers, basically. If you didn't know their position, you would look at their numbers and say, that guy's putting up production like a center, and you go, no, they're actually a guard, which is that's ridiculous, right? During his unanimous MVP season, Steph Curry is rebounding like mad, stealing like mad, shooting like mad, and still passing at a better assist to turnover ratio, I believe, than an average point guard, which that was ridiculous. And we never get to, I don't think we never get to see Steph Curry considered a mainstream star compete against Kobe Bryant. But obviously, Steph Curry is another name. Steph Curry. Like, if there are players that you're like, why isn't this player a top 5 player? Steph Curry is one of those. Steph Curry, James Harden, Russell Westbrook, LeBron James, and Kevin Durant. That's 5 players that I could legitimately just say are the top 5 every year from like 2014 on for a bit, right? And it's not hard. So that is the crux of our Kobe argument. It is really hard to make the top 5. And so basically just breaking Kobe Bryant's career into 3 parts, I thought that was the key, is to say in none of the 3 parts of his career, next to the most dominant big man of the early 2000s on his own, next to a great big in Pau Gasol, during none of these eras was he the top 5 player in the NBA. And that's even if we restrict it to conventional wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a pretty damning argument, but, I don't think you're going to convince everyone despite that.
Well, I mean, I kind of said I thought the analytics revolution is moving backwards, and this year proves it, right? This year we had Russell Westbrook on a below 50 win team, which is the first time this has happened since Moses Malone won the MVP back in the 80s. This is the first time a below 50 win team has won the MVP with Russell Westbrook. And what did he do? He led the NBA in points, albeit inefficiently. Now, by the way, we love his triple doubles, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we don't think if he had gotten 15 points per game and done the triple double thing, I gotta buy he would not have won MVP. That's
absolutely.
The top pick in the draft, Markelle Fultz, that the 76ers traded up for. They mucked me up on last week's show, Brian, because I was like, the Celtics drafted Markelle Fultz. Nope. It turns out the 76ers spent multiple top 3 picks to get him, was on a losing team. So this is like the year of yay points. Kobe Bryant is the king of yay points, right? And I think it does a lot to his legacy in that the 2 players that are above him, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was a 70s player that most people aren't going to remember. And Karl Malone, retired right before the big expansion, the big boom. I mean, he was on the Lakers in 2004, but, he wasn't in the NBA in the 2000s when there was this big thing. Kobe Bryant was the face of the league. So, it does a lot. People will basically say he's the greatest scorer because it's easy to forget the others. Other sports like baseball, you don't forget Hank Aaron, you don't forget Babe Ruth, but baseball is the sport where I'm amazed that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is so often left out of all-time great discussions when he's got the most regular season MVPs of all time. I can't remember if it's multiple finals MVPs, but let's also not forget the finals MVP did not exist for his first finals. And leads the NBA in scoring. It's a ridiculous thing that he's regularly left off the list. I do think the NBA has a lot of attention deficit in terms of how people remember and think of all-time greats. And Kobe does benefit from a lot of points with recency bias. Like I'm saying, if you go over his career, like I said, I've done in 2 articles now, he's not a top 20 all-time great. He was never a top 5 player in the NBA. I can maybe say 2008, 2013, he was close. But 2 years, almost being a top 5 player. If I basically chop the legs off the competition right, that doesn't make you a top 5 all-timer. So that's my Kobe hate, Brian. That's probably going to do it for me at this point, right? His career is all said and done. I've compared him to Tim Duncan. I'm going to have 2 articles saying why he's not an all-time great. I think that's probably going to do it for me, and just hopefully those articles live on in perpetuity forever.
And I just had a wave of dread come over you when you started comparing basketball analysis to baseball analysis. Like, the 8 points comparison there is like, oh, yeah, Hank Aaron, one of the best players of all time, right? Hit all those home runs. What about Sandy Koufax? No, he didn't hit any home runs. He sucks. Doesn't pitching matter for baseball? No, dingers.
And then, of course, well, it's funny about baseball, and this is true in basketball, too, in terms of advanced analytics, getting off on the last tangent. I love that in all of these sports, you basically have people that just kind of make up. They're like, I think pitching is 60% of the game or 40% of the game or defense of the game. It's really amusing. It happens in lots of sports, and that's why we have Kobe being, right? Because basically people have decided that taking shots is a skill and offense is the most important thing, even if they won't say it. Here's a simple fact. Multiple Defensive Player of the Year winners, meaning they won the Defensive Player of the Year multiple times. This is Sid Moncrief was the first Defensive Player of the Year winner and won it back-to-back. Dennis Rodman, I believe, won it twice as well. They didn't make first ballot Hall of Fame. And so whenever anybody tries to bring up defense as an argument, I'm like, maybe one day, but let's just be honest with ourselves. It is not valued as highly by the analytics crew. People have spent so much work, right? There was an article, I brought up Neil Payne already. There's an article called mentioning 2008, talking about Kobe Bryant, and said all these new stats needed to come about to explain why Kobe Bryant was great. No, the reality was people couldn't reconcile with the fact that Kobe Bryant's shooting average wasn't great. And so they basically kept tweaking the numbers until there were numbers that came out. And you can see this in lots of Sloan papers where basically the way people explain it is they say, here's my metric. I'm going to show you the player that you know is great. And the metric lines up with that. So you know this is a good metric, which is not how you're supposed to grade analytics. But that being said, that's why Kobe Bryant's always going to be considered an all-timer, even when you go through the numbers, you go through the narratives. It's actually pretty easy to see why he's not. And that's even, like I said, the metaphor I used was cutting off the legs. I cut off the legs of a lot of good players I'd love to include. And even doing that, I was still able to find 5 players every year that were better than Kobe.
Hey, I read that Kobe assist article. No one else has named Kobe, so therefore Kobe is the best at it because he's named Kobe. There you go.
Fair enough. All right, Brian. Well, I think we went over an hour, so I got in everything I wanted to get in. I don't really mind if this show isn't contemporary. It can kind of stand on its own next to, like I said, the long-term plan is I'm going to release this as an article with the podcast next to it. Anything else you want to add before we head out?
No, yeah, I'm done. We can push out all this other stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, next week we'll be back with a more normal Boxscore Geek show where we might
Game of Thrones talk.
So by the way, this is a game I'm hoping to play going forward, which is going to be Game of Thrones versus Rick and Morty, which I think lines up well because I think they're going to have a similar number of episodes, right? Like Rick and Morty has 11.
Game of Thrones is 8 this season, I think.
Okay, nice. So this
but they are twice as long though.
One nice thing about Rick and Morty in the past, though, is that Rick and Morty, they haven't had problems doing their big booms, so to speak, not at normal intervals, right? They basically had episodes that could have been considered the season finale earlier in the season. So we'll be able to do Rick and Morty versus Game of Thrones. Brian, why aren't we able to do that this week?
Yeah, I failed. I didn't watch Rick and Morty yet, so I've only seen the first episode that came out like a month ago. So yeah, I have to catch up.
Which is great. I mean, let's actually, yeah, that's this. Yeah, Rick and Morty is going to go longer, sadly. If it had been the other way around, if Rick and Morty had started earlier. So Rick and Morty is on episode 2. Game of Thrones will be on episode 3 next week. So they'll be
just
off.
had 3. It's doing 4 next week.
4 next week.
Yeah.
So it's going to be episode 3 versus 4, which means Rick and Morty will go long before. But we will do Rick and Morty versus Game of Thrones this week. It's really rough. I'm going to call it a push. I thought both episodes.
So it's just which one is better? Which one do you like more? Is that the question?
Which episode is better? I'm calling it a push. I'm not saying either episode is bad. In fact, I thought both were good. But I didn't think either wowed me enough to basically win the week. So I'm going to say I like Rick and Morty. I like Game of Thrones. We'll see what happens going forward. Anyway, that's been our show. I've been your host, Ray Alvarez. You can find me on Twitter as Nerd Numbers. Produced, as always, by Boxscore Brian. Real name Brian Foster. I don't know why I reversed those, Brian. You can find our show at boxscoregeeks.com. If you don't know the website, we're on iTunes and Stitcher as the Boxscore Geek Show. We go live every week, usually Tuesday or Wednesday on twitch.tv/Nerd Numbers. 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We went a little early this week. And if you missed the live show, you can catch the recaps on channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube. That's been our show, and we'll see you next time.